Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Conor, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm talking with Gilbert, Whiteduck, and Yenny, Vega, Cardenas, both of whom are working to see the rights of nature acknowledged and respected. We're going to chat about legal personhood for rivers like the Tenàgàdino Zibi and the Magpie River, what this means and how it was achieved in the case of the latter. We're going to chat about how you can look into protecting the rights of nature where you live. We're also going to talk about hope for the future, what to say when electoral candidates come to your door, and growing a grassroots movement that can make change in leaps and bounds. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, including, as of the broadcast of this episode, a petition on the rights of nature you can sign, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. And a quick note that as of the launch of this episode on July 30th, 2024, for the next 3 days we will be holding emissions cap town halls in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador tonight, and Fredericton and Sackville, New Brunswick over the next 2 days respectively. You can find out more at sierraclub.ca/town halls. Gilbert, Yenny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
First of all, for those joining in, can you give us a brief intro to who you are and what you do?
I'm Yenny Vega Cardenas. I'm a lawyer and president of the International Observatory on Nature's Rights, based in Montreal. Through the observatory, we promote nature's rights to improve the legal protection of natural entities in Canada and around the world.
Kakina, Gilbert Whiteduck, Tenàgàdino Zibi Nindonshaba. My name is Gilbert Whiteduck from the Algonquin Anishinaabe community of Kitigan Zibi. I'm Algonquin Anishinaabe myself. I've resided in this territory, Western Quebec, for all of my life. I'm involved in many things. I was chief in a community at one point. I was counselor. I've done many things touching the land or in negotiations or discussions with municipalities and a number of things. All of these areas related to biodiversity and the rights of nature, especially that concept of the rights of nature, are very important to me and are historically important. And I hope that what I'm bringing is what the ancestors would have hoped that the future generations would be bringing, especially in light to what's going on with nature and against nature, whether it be in Canada or around the world.
And so that sort of brings us into today's topic, because you've both worked or are working on getting, and I saw this term used, jurisdictional personhood for natural spaces like Magpie River and the Tenàgàdino Zibi or Gatineau River. For people tuning in who are new to that concept, we've had a previous episode on the rights of nature as like a general concept. But what does jurisdictional personhood mean, or legal personhood mean, and how does it tie into that concept of rights of nature?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, since this is one of the questions that comes very often, we have written a blog in our website where you can find a simple explanations in just one page. It's www.observatoirenature.org. In essence, legal personality is the institution that defines whether an entity or being is a holder of rights. So it is the channel that exists in our current legal system to identify what really matters in law. It also allows us to represent the interest and rights to that entity before the courts, so that that person has legal standing.
Because I know corporations, for instance, have sort of a version of this actually underneath Canadian law. They're an organization, obviously, but they have a jurisdictional personhood.
Exactly. For example, human beings, we are endowed with legal personhood, which allow us to recognize us as a subject of rights. So we have the right to live, the right to health, the right to freedom of speech. But also when people are gathered together, reunited together with a purpose, they can start a corporations or create a corporations. And that corporation has a legal personhood. It also has rights. And the same is happening for natural entities. So like rivers, mountains, forests, jungles, they have been bestowed with certain inherent rights like the rights of preservation, maintenance, and restoration. So legal personhood is a channel that allows us to protect a natural entity or a person or a human person or a moral person that is a corporation. So it's a very useful tool to hear the voice of people, of objectives, and now natural entities as rivers. So to listen the voice of the river is a very important channel that we can use toward a better protection of those entities in law, in our legal systems.
I know that the Magpie River in Quebec was given legal personhood by the Innu Council of Equinetchit and the Mingani Regional County and Municipality. What did that process look like, and what have been some of the outcomes for the river since?
That process was unique. So for the recognition of the legal personhood for the Magpie River, it begins with a conversation between indigenous and non-indigenous, only individuals. People were concerned with the protection of the river before a dam project in this particular river. So they wanted to know how they could protect the river to make the voice of the river to be heard. So we went there and we started to analyze different cases around the world to find the best way to recognize the legal rights of the river to be heard. So we came to a consensus on the importance of elevating the river as a person and giving it rights and legal standing so that its voice could be heard around the world. But of course, the leadership of the Innu of the Quanichit was a key part of the process, because they were already in contact with the Maori in the New Zealand, who had recognized already the legal personhood of a sacred river there, the Whanganui River. So they wanted to follow that path. So a consensus was reached with the concurrence of the regional county municipality of Mangani, who wanted also to work with the Innu to protect the river. So an important consensus that we could found there. That's why we say always that was a perfect case. So the passage or the adoption of these twin resolutions, was a demonstration of a truly beautiful understanding, cooperation, and even reconciliation between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples in the north coast of Quebec. And now the river is a legal entity with rights, and its voice has been heard around the world. So now we can say that it's now one of the most recognized rivers in Canada, because it now has a story to tell between generations. And it is a powerful example of how a river, to understand how a river is sacred and should be preserved for future generations, and how important it is to change also the relationship we have with rivers. Example that we have, beautiful examples to follow.
And I'm interested in that. You said it also was sort of a forum for reconciliation within the communities as well. I wasn't aware of that aspect, but that's very interesting.
The chief, Jean-Charles Pietachot, said it before the ONU instances. He said, many people are speaking about reconciliation, but we are not speaking, we are doing it.
Yeah.
And it's great because he was there presenting the case also with the prefect or the director of the regional county municipality of Mangani, who were really good friends.
Well, and Gilbert, I read in an article covering your speech at last year's Gatineau River Fest that you're hoping people will start a dialogue on the personhood of the Tenàgàdino Zibi in Gatineau River. Can you chat more about what you feel is important about dialogue and gaining personhood for places like the river?
Well, it means a lot. And let me just come back a little bit, I suppose, on what happened with the Magpie and
Sure.
maybe some of the differences that we're working with. For me, because we acknowledge as Indigenous people that we live in a very colonized Canadian society with the colonizers' justice system. So words matter. Words are very important. Whether we're saying jurisdictional personhood, the rights of the river, and then the use of an indigenous language versus English or French can be very different in its meaning. And for me, the work that we were attempting to initiate by engaging people, whether it be indigenous and non-indigenous, together in having a greater understanding, in our case, about one of many rivers in our territory, because we believe that if we can solidify something over one river, then really it should duplicate itself in other rivers in our unceded, unsurrendered territory, and that's very important. But the basis of it, from the teachings I get, it's two main components. One of them is teachings from the sacred or sacred law that guides us, and then natural law that guides us. And each one of those bring us teachings that, as Yenny has indicated, that Nibi, water, the water as a voice. And that voice, like nature, needs to be listened to. And how all of these are connected together and connected to humanity. When we're impacting the water, whether it be a river, large, small, or streams, we're impacting humanity. Now, what are we going to do about it? What are the limitations? How do we engage individuals who up to now had not given reflection? They're having to do a paradigm shift in thinking and the words that they use in relationship to the land and the water. There's a rethinking and bringing people together. And that's what I've been trying to do at a very minuscule level, bringing people together, at least from the region, as much as we can and collectively can, to have a dialogue and discussion and say, what does it mean to you when you think about it? And more importantly, what will it mean to your children and grandchildren and future generation? Because what we're doing now is really not just for us now, it's all of what is to come. And that's what's important, trying to get people thinking about that, and there's been an interest, there's been an engagement. People are still having difficulty to understand, to saying, well, what does it mean? You're going to take control of the river? You're going to stop all development? Because already on the river there are 3 hydro dams. It's different than the Magpie.
Right.
386 kilometers long. It used to have many, many rapids, but that has changed with the dams. And there are many villages and towns, and it empties into the Kitchissippi, into the Ottawa River. So these are all aspects that need to be considered. And as I've often said, it's not about stopping development. It's about taking care of the river in the best possible way. And when development is to be considered, that there be increased factors to be looked at before any development is allowed. Because the idea here is not to confront, it's not to say no, no, no to everything, but rather we need to do a deeper reflection each time we do it, and say and ask ourselves, are we hearing the voice of that water that's been flowing for hundreds and thousands of years, have been flowing and have been used and misused, in our case, not for environmental purposes, but for economic reasons? It's been misused and will continue. And how do we engage people? And that takes work, and that takes connection between people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, talking to each other and understanding each other, and saying it's not the non-Indigenous people that will take the lead. We will do it together. We will do it together, and we will do it by listening to the voice of that river. And how do we do that? That takes work. That takes rethinking. That takes my experience up to now, having met many, many people, it takes a lot of reflection. It's just not how they were raised for most people. Some, yes, I have to acknowledge. But for many others, it's just not where they're at. So I know, and I'm going to be patient and be hopeful that change can be brought about, like the Magpie in this river, but other rivers, and that kind of not new approach, because for us it's not a new approach. It's an historical way of how things were done, how the rivers were taken care of, and the purpose of the water that flows. But to have that understanding go out there, and indeed, Canada as a whole speaks about reconciliation. And very often it's a very broad term of what that means, reconciliation. Some would say we need reconciliation. Where is the action, and what are the benefits And what are the benefits? And they cannot be benefits that come to individuals. It's a collective benefit that we have to seek, a collective benefit for all generations. So again, dialogue, connection, getting to know each other, because Indigenous people and Canadians in general, we don't know each other very well. I've made many presentations, we don't know each other. And the history of Canada is not well known. And therefore, when I speak of sacred law, natural law as being fundamental in hearing the voice of the river, it engages people. It pushes them against the wall to question what they have been doing also. Not in a negative way, never in a negative way, but in a reflective way that will be meaningful. And I'm hoping that when I have, and my colleagues have some of those discussions, that these individuals are going back home and within their family talking about it and saying, what did they mean? And what does it mean for us? And getting that dialogue going, especially among younger people who are either in leadership positions or on the verge to take on leadership. So they need to feel it also and have that understanding in order to kind of catapult it or ramp it up to where it is that some of these things need to go. I mean, in this region, in the Outaouais region, in the Gatineau Valley region, but really across Quebec and across Canada for that matter, and let alone around the world.
Well, and it's interesting you say that dialogue, the dialogue being a dialogue with the river as well, and with the space that you're talking about, because that's something too. When we did the Rights of Nature podcast, the earlier one, that was something that came up. This idea that there would be this conversation now, not just between people, but between people in a natural space, was something that caught me off guard. And it's funny, but I get exposed to a lot of environmental concepts through my work and everything. And even for me, when I first heard about the rights of nature and people were first bringing it to me, I guess maybe because I've been so involved in the activist side, and in quotation marks, I've been so involved with the fighting over a topic with somebody thing. My mind first goes to what's going to be the knee-jerk reaction to this, right? Like somebody will go, "Oh, it's anti-development" or something like that. My head was immediately there as an activist, whereas as opposed to what you're talking about, which is much more having conversations and actually talking about these concepts and having a conversation with the natural world as well.
Well, I think the goal in my mind, what I've come to learn, it's the connection with people. That connection and what we can call grassroots. And that takes time, because it's not only about large gatherings and a lot of people and beautiful speeches. It's really being able to reach people fundamentally in their heart, really, and what that means, and then that understanding about how we work together, because in Canada, let alone in Quebec, that relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is still very, very difficult. It's continues to appear that we don't have our place. We only have our place when it benefits the non-Indigenous society. Then we're invited. As I often say, we are invited to many things, but it's a little bit like being invited to supper. You're invited to supper, but you're not allowed to sit at the adult table. We're put at the children's table. And I'm saying that has to change. And in some places it has changed, depending on how that dialogue is going. But it takes persistence, it takes work, it takes trying to define even those terminologies, colonial terminology of legal personhood. The river always had it. Really, the river always had it. It's just that government law, society in general, the foundation of Canada, the constitutional foundation of Canada didn't really take those things into consideration in a way that it should have. I think for Indigenous people, maybe we assumed that it had, but we quickly found out how governments can quickly change laws, environmental laws, soften them up for the benefit of corporations very quickly. So even in the work that we're doing, we need to be mindful that even though we may believe we've made gains, that we always have to be so vigilant and be able to voice very openly in a respectful but affirmative manner the concerns that we collectively have and what we need to do to work together to bring about those changes. And as we well know, and as we well hear, we're on that brink of major impact. It's happening for sure. But for me, environmental changes don't happen within a year. They happen over decades. But it's when you're able to focus on what that means in a bigger picture that I think we become not alarmed, but maybe more involved, more prepared to invest a little bit of ourselves, because there are many issues in Canada, but we invest a bit of ourselves through our voice, through the people that we elect to parliament, through the people that are representative of organizations and whatnot, and are doing those things. For me, that has become very important. But it's been a real interesting, not challenging, but eye opener for me in the past couple of years. And I want to mention this here. For me, when we speak of the voice of the river, which is so important, because I travel down to Ottawa from my community, 130 kilometers away along the river, and I look at the river, and I've often said this. I said, when I travel, and again, many, many years of doing politics and education and whatnot, in my mind, at times when I'm driving, sometimes on a beautiful evening or early in the morning, the fog is just rising. And on other days, the water is just sparkling. There's something magical going on. I think in my mind of my ancestors, the ancestors of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, paddling either up or down the river, having to portage them at the time without the dams, the many portages in order to get into the territory. And I wonder, in my mind, the spirits of who they were is still there. And as I'm driving, what are they thinking of me in the sense of taking care of this sacred water? Well, what are they thinking of me? I'm thinking about them, that as they canoed or up or down, that they were under the belief, for sure, that it would always remain from what they saw. And keeping in mind, along this river, like many other rivers in our ancestral territory, there's burial sites. There were people born alongside that river. There are people that died alongside that river. There were ceremonies. So you have the sacredness of the water. You have the sacredness of what took place along, in this case, 386 kilometers of the river. So there's an overall sacredness that comes to put an envelope around all of this, along then that combines to the sacredness of water, as we well know the importance of water. And it comes down to, so what are we going to do concretely? And how can we do it? And indeed, what is the role of government within all of this? Federal, provincial, municipal governments, organizations, all of these things. And for me, it starts from people. I'm a strong believer in people movements. I get weary when governments all of a sudden get interested. And I know they have a role to play, but I get weary when they get too involved and they want to control where the canoe is going to travel and how it's going to travel. And they start paddling. And they say, just sit back, we'll take care of it. No, it's got to be a people movement, because each individual, I often compare it, each individual brings a grain of sand or a drop of water. We'll say a drop of water. And that drop of water that we all bring is what creates that road of opportunity and hope that things should not, at a minimum, get worse. Can't allow it. That we need to be thinking about things getting better and moving beyond status quo. Huge challenge. It is a challenge. Many people I meet and people wanting to take control, who leads, who, all that kind of thing. And I say, no, 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 stop for a minute. It's not about us. It's about the sacred water, not about us, directly about us. It is, but we can't forget the water and the voice that it has and what it's telling us. We can't neglect that because all of a sudden we as humans, we want to control everything. We want to have a say over everything. We want, we're the most powerful. Well, the most powerful is our environment, is really that biodiversity and that connection of all of these things, which includes water, which nourishes all of these things. And we in turn are connected because for us, Algonquin and Anishinaabe, I mean, our roots are in this territory that goes back thousands of years. This is where ancestors lived and used and connected and prayed and tried to understand. And I take it now that my generation, generations to come, have the sacred responsibility to do what we can in the best way we can. Unfortunately, within a colonized state, which is Canada, with its laws and whatnot, we work within that paradigm that's been imposed on us. But we maintain our own paradigm of sacredness and natural law that hopefully guides us in a good way.
Well, and it's true, the story, and I mean, like, again, maybe I'm a little biased here. Part of my job is obviously monitoring news headlines every day, and the story is very much always one of decline, right? The natural world is declining, or we're seeing more destruction. That proactivity that you mentioned, that idea that actually we can have gains for the environment, that something can be proactive and building, it's so missing from the dialogue that we have nationally and in the media. It's something that's, yeah, it's very sad not to see it there. I did want to ask you about that sort of governmental interaction with this, because obviously there are going to be lots of different levels of government. In the case of the Magpie, you were talking about sort of municipal governments, I think, being quite involved, or regional government, right, being quite involved. And we've also seen the release of a preliminary for the National Biodiversity Strategy and those sorts of policies recently. I'm curious if you see connections between those policies and if there's anything that maybe they're doing or failing to do.
Yeah, in fact, I'm totally agree with what Gilbert says already, that it's important the involvement of people and also different organizations as Sierra Club and others in the Rights of Nature movement, because we have tried to ask governments also and politicians to embrace the movement, and it's not easy to get there. But I think I really consider that it's the right time to all people who are now listening to us, to ask the governments and politicians to fulfill their commitments to protect nature and take action to fight biodiversity crisis and climate change. Because if they really want to do something to make a difference, it is to recognize at their level, federal or provincial, that nature has rights. One statement is enough. We have asked already the federal government several times to recognize that not only do people have rights to a healthy environment, but that nature also has rights because it has an intrinsic value. And I don't know if you are aware, but some of the old water regulations are going to be revised at the federal level in the next year. So this could be an opportunity to include the rights of rivers. And the same could be done at the provincial level. So I think it's time for action, for us to mobilize ourselves, to ask them to do what they need to do, what has to be done. And at the municipal level, they can work hand in hand with Indigenous nations to recognize legal personhood and rights to specific rivers that are found within their jurisdiction and act as legal guardians. They will be very effective because local communities are in a better position to protect rivers, to monitor them, and to recognize when some interested are not respecting the regulation already in place, and are harming the river in a significant way. So we really believe in local communities, Indigenous nations, but please ask your representatives, your governments, federal, at the provincial and local level to take action to recognize the rights of nature, because it's very, very powerful to protect nature for future generations. Humans are not humans.
For people maybe looking at personhood for natural spaces elsewhere who are interested in the work that you're doing and they'd like to do something similar, what would you recommend their first steps be?
Yeah, we invite people to read some of our blogs to try to understand better the movement. Also, our book that we have launched on the legal personhood for the San Lorenzo River and other rivers of the world. They can start because we have many cases. For example, the case of Ecuador that is very interesting. Colombian case too, the Tenàgàdino River in New Zealand, so they can start learning what happened in other countries. And also we have published a text on the Magpie River and also in the Quebec law system and how it is prepared to make now the important step of recognizing the rights of river. They can also find some webinars in our website, and then when they are really, they can also better understand the implications of the nature's right movement. They can identify a natural entity to be protected. Once this exercise is done, we encourage them to contact the International Observatory on Nature's Rights, as we have more and more volunteers to help communities start these processes in a successful way. So we can give them some orientation. But first of all, they should read a little bit, look in our website, and we have webinars, blogs, and the book too, and then to be prepared to do the big step.
I'm curious too, like for your work, Gilbert, what's the next step?
Well, there's a couple of things. We know that we need to have better data in regards to the river. There's a lot of data available, especially for the southern part of the river, but we'd like to have more data for all of the river. So there is work to try to secure some funding to hire some expertise that would help us, and including elders, of course, to help us gather some of that data and then make that data available on our website. That's one thing. We are now finalizing, because we created an alliance, a group of people who came together and we're forming that alliance, and without wanting though to make it into a corporate structure. I'm not a believer in make this in a corporate structure, and then we lose perspective from that. So we got to be careful of how we're going to formulate all of this. And we continue speaking to people at every event in every possible way. But again, studying the river and laying out some of the important issues that need to be considered, continuing to raise these questions, if there are questions or reflections, more importantly, with municipal governments or at public forums. Federal elections are around the corner very soon, and asking the individual candidates who will be running in this riding, which by the way is called Pontiac Zibi. It's interesting that it's now called Pontiac Zibi, which is the name of our community. Someone in the federal government decided that that's what they were going to do. And as I once asked someone, do you even know why it's called Pontiac and who Pontiac was? The Grand Chief Pontiac and whatnot, and most people don't know. Anyhow, asking these individuals who are running, where do you stand on it? And what are you prepared to do as an individual MP? I understand the party as position, but where do you stand on it? And what are you prepared to do? Which is different for me. And that seeking some level of commitment that they're going to be a strong voice whenever and however this issue of the water and the rivers and the biodiversity comes up, or if they're a standing committee or whatever the case may be, they will be a voice, because hopefully they will be the voice of the people, because that's what you are. You're elected to be the voice of the people. And if the people are saying this is what we want you to advance, and it may go against your party sometimes, I get it. But I would hope that when you're speaking, you're the voice of the people. It's the voice of the people that will trump even your own party's position. That's my belief. That's how I would approach it.
In what is always a difficult time in terms of polarization on issues, I think it's always refreshing when somebody, no matter what particular perspective they come from, is willing to talk about the natural environment and represent people, and maybe break sometimes with what they feel like they would have to say, but actually to represent what they hopefully truly believe in, right?
Well, what I have to say about that, having been a local politician in a sense as chief in the community and then counselor and whatnot, like I don't believe in being muzzled. I don't, you say what you believe and not without just saying anything. Got to say something that's important, and to the thing. But being able to voice those things, that's a responsibility for me. It's a sacred responsibility that we have, and maybe too often that has not been the case, where people have been silent or they become really good at detouring and going all over the place without ever saying anything. And then at the end saying, oh, reconciliation. Kind of hear the word reconciliation. Well, reconciliation, yes, with Indigenous people, reconciliation with the biodiversity. We have a reconciliation with nature and the rights that they carry. And that reconciliation, each one of us, in the best way that we can, where no human is perfect, but in the best way we can to find ways to have the reconciliation again, for the present moment, but more importantly, for the future. And one of the things that I repeat when I'm given the opportunity is that when I look ahead 25 years, who knows, 50 years, whatever the time period is, and I'm long gone, you're long gone, we're all long gone. I'm hoping that the generations that are going to be in that time, and when they're looking back, because they're going to look back as we look back at our history, I'm hoping that when they look back, they're going to say, you know what? These people, a lot of, not all of them, but a lot of them came together and they did things to ensure that we have the biodiversity, and they moved the discussion in regards to the rights of the rivers and nature forward. They did things. They didn't achieve everything they wanted to. They squabbled and whatnot. That's okay. But you know what? They didn't just remain status quo or regress. Rather than the future generations looking back and say it was on the brink and they had an opportunity, but all they did was talk and they weren't honest. And look where we're at now. I'm hoping that that will never happen. And I'm saying the little drop of water I can bring, I hope that this will bring that kind of reflection in generations to come. When I'm, like I say, I'm in a spirit world elsewhere, still in the territory, but part of all of that. So that in my mind, whenever, I'm reflecting and talking to people, I think about. Another thing I just want to point out is, for me, is that all of this is important for everyone. And I know decision makers, but most important for those young people that are just coming up, the elementary children, the teenagers. So the education system has a tremendous role to make this part of curriculum and discussion within the schools. I know some teachers do it. Having been an educator for 30 years, I know some do it, some don't. But we must find ways to sow the seed of understanding very early on so that we're not trying to get people to unlearn things to teach them new things, that they will already have a lot of those things to bring forward an understanding. And certainly this will allow for these issues that we're facing today in Canada and elsewhere in the world to move forward not in baby steps, but in leaps and bounds. I don't think we can allow, and I know that's where we're at, it's baby steps, and maybe I'm not patient enough, but it's leaps and bounds. We have so much, we're already losing so much, we know what's happening, and we need to invigor. There's a word that sometimes uses, it's called volition. And volition is that word, the meaning is that energy that we have inside of us, of who we are as human beings, and the spirit we carry that propels us to achieving things. Is that propelling? And we need to find that, or we need to create it. We need to ensure that it's there for this and future generations.
I share your sense of impatience sometimes with this. Before we go today, I just want to ask, is there anything else you'd both like to say, or I know we'll have links to the Alliance below and links to all the organizations that you're working with, below the podcast, but is there anything else you'd like to say to people, or is there anywhere that they should be going to find information?
With the Tenàgàdino Alliance, I think it's still just to have a look at our website and whatnot. But more importantly, I think is for any individual listening to the podcast is to have their own reflection and to seek out and talking to other people, maybe reading some books, but to talk to people and to make this a part of their conversation at whatever level that they're at. Make it. One voice becomes 10 voices, and 10 voices become louder. At last, there's such a roar. One can compare it is that each individual is one fire, and we're many fires, and we need to pull all of those fires together to make one large fire of change. But it begins by each individual, and where they're at, and then learning more, finding out, questioning. And that doesn't mean it's, accepting everything that everybody says. No, questioning it, finding out, and making your own determination based on fact and information, based on, what you've learned over time, and combining it. But again, thinking, what does this mean for the future? If I don't do anything, if I don't say anything, what will that mean? And how can we come together collectively? Because we must. And I believe, I really do, that we will.
Yenny, Gilbert, miigwech, thank you so much for joining me today.
Miigwech, appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
Hi everybody, Conor, Head of Communications, jumping in again here to do the Q&A for today's episode. And before I get into the answer for today's question, I just want to state the answers to these questions are entirely on behalf of Sierra Club Canada. They don't reflect the views of our guests, so I just want to make that clear before we begin. We got a question from somebody asking, why don't farmers affected by weather events just get insurance? Weather is unpredictable and we've got nothing to do with it. And I want to respond to this because I think it's actually important that we reach out to these questions. And more importantly, maybe for those of you listening, show how to maybe respond to one of these questions. So first of all, one of the issues with climate change and the weather events that we are in fact very much responsible for producing as a species is that we're making weather more unpredictable, and it's actually getting very hard for people to get insurance, especially if they're in flood prone areas, because insurance companies are basically saying we don't want to take the risk. I mean, if it's that unpredictable, they don't even want to take the risk giving somebody insurance. So we can't just ask farmers affected by extreme weather events to just get insurance. I don't think anybody could turn around to, for instance, somebody affected by forest fires, in fact thousands of Canadians at the time of this recording who are being evacuated in Alberta and in BC, and say to them, why don't you just get insurance? We build lives, we invest in things, and even if there was insurance that would cover any damages we had, that doesn't mean that people deserve to lose their homes. And we can prevent it. We can prevent it with very little effort, in fact, because the primary cause of the emissions that are creating these wildfires, that are creating severe weather events, that are flooding farmers' fields, or causing droughts for other farmers that they cannot adapt to in time, the primary cause is not even individual people. The primary cause is large industries who have been making insane profits, just incredible profits, without having to regulate themselves at all, while saying to governments, we will regulate ourselves, don't worry about our emissions. And quite literally, if we just regulated those industries, if we just made them pay for the pollution that they produce, we can actually make a huge step towards addressing that pollution. And I know that some people are going to talk about the whole, well, it's not Canada's fault, there are other countries with far bigger emissions profiles, things. You're probably going to hear a lot of that if you're listening to this podcast. Canada has very high per capita emissions. And again, that's not down to individuals' faults per se. That's actually one of the reasons we've always missed our emissions targets as a country is, again, those large, heavy industry actors, especially the oil and gas industry. And that's why an emissions cap on the oil and gas industry is so important, because we do have other industries in this country. We do have industries like farming that people rely on that actually produces food, something that realistically we can't do without. We can change away from oil and gas. We can never actually exist without food. Prioritizing those, putting those first, and making extremely wealthy corporations pay the price for the pollution is one big way on how we can actually help people. We can't just ask people to get insurance. There isn't the money out there to deal with the amount of adaptation we would need to deal with in order to deal with just runaway climate change. There is no way to adapt out of this situation that doesn't involve a huge number of people worldwide dying as a result of it, and losing their homes, and being displaced, and all of the other effects that we say. And you say to yourself, like, how inconvenient is it if tomorrow, if your home floods, or your home catches on fire? How inconvenient is that to you? Ask yourself that. Okay, that's the best case scenario for a lot of people, not only around the world, but in Canada with climate change. That's their best case scenario. Because the worst case scenario for a lot of them is that they lose family members, is that they lose people they love, that they lose entire communities to this. So we really need to be thinking about, how do we make changes now that prevent the impacts in the future? Again, if at this point, if you can turn around and hear these stories and say, weather is just unpredictable, get insurance. If you can turn around and ignore the thousands of people who have been evacuated, maybe we don't have anything to say to each other at that point, because maybe there's nothing I can say to convince this person. But I tell you what, there's a lot of other people out there who need to know the connection between climate change, extreme weather, and the emissions of the oil and gas industry. That's why we're having some town halls over the next few days, as we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. It's why you should chat to others about this issue. Because yes, you won't convince everybody, but there are a lot of people on the fence. There are a lot of people out there going, but is climate change really that serious? I know it's real, but is it really that serious? Go talk to those people. Go chat to them. I hope this gave a little insight, at least for the people listening, as to how to talk about some of these issues. I think we need to tell stories. We need to tell facts, but we also need to tell stories about how this affects people personally, because it does. And we need to ground those in facts, but we need to make the impacts noticeable and real and talk about what they actually mean for people, because it's easy enough to dismiss a headline like thousands of people evacuated. If you've ever met people who need to evacuate an area, they are not just statistics. They're not just numbers. It's too much when it's one family that needs to evacuate. It's too much. And people have lost whole communities. People have lost their entire lives. People have lost loved ones. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca with tons of petitions, including, as of the broadcast of this episode, a petition on the rights of nature you can sign, other actions events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. And again, check out those 3 town halls happening tonight, tomorrow night, and the third night in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, Fredericton, New Brunswick, and Sackville, New Brunswick. More on that at sierraclub.ca/town halls.